Imagine a continent teeming with rich cultures, vast landscapes, and untold natural wealth. Now, imagine that same continent divided, dissected, and handed out like pieces of a pie, all without the consent of its people. This is the story of Africa in 1884, the year European powers gathered in Berlin to decide the fate of an entire continent. Welcome to the Berlin Conference of 1884, where Africa was carved up for imperial conquest. But why did this happen? How did Europe justify such an audacious move? And what were the consequences for Africa and the world? In this deep dive, we explore the political maneuvering, the greed, and the tragic legacy of the Berlin Conference. Stay tuned as we uncover the great African divide. To understand the Berlin Conference, we must first understand the world in the late 19th century. Europe was in the throes of the Industrial Revolution, and with it came an insatiable appetite for resources that Europe itself could not provide. Coal, gold, rubber, ivory. These were the lifeblood of European industry and the treasures of Africa. But Europe wasn't just hungry for resources, it was also locked in a fierce competition for global dominance. Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, and others were all vying to expand their empires. Colonies were not just symbols of power, they were essential for national security and economic prosperity. Africa, with its vast unexplored interior, was the final frontier. Yet Africa was no empty land. It was home to powerful kingdoms, sophisticated societies, and millions of people. But to the European powers, it was a dark continent, mysterious, unknown, and ripe for conquest. This was the dangerous cocktail that led to the Berlin Conference. For an extensive period of 14 weeks and 5 days, from November 15, 1884 to February 26, 1885, the European powers meticulously devised and executed their strategies to carve up the African continent. This pivotal event, famously known as the Berlin Conference, took place in what is now modern-day Germany. It was here, in Berlin, that European nations sat around a map, decisively dividing African territories among themselves, while the voices and presence of Africans were conspicuously absent from the discussions. This conference stands as a historic testament to the audacity and calculated precision with which European powers asserted their dominance over Africa. This was no accidental oversight or mere exclusion. It was a grand, orchestrated act of legalized daylight robbery. The European powers, in their arrogant self-assurance, deemed Africans irrelevant and unfit to have any say over their own lands. To these imperial invaders, Africans were labeled as uncivilized, in desperate need of the guidance that only these European saviors could provide. Within the walls of the Berlin Conference, towns, lands, and rivers were reduced to mere lines on a map. With the casual stroke of a pencil and the precision of a ruler, borders were drawn, territories were claimed, and trade routes were strategically altered or erased, all without the slightest regard for the people whose lives would be forever changed. In a breathtaking display of arrogance, the rich historical heritage, cultural laws, sovereignty, and time-honored institutions of African peoples, established over millennia, were completely disregarded. Africa, the world's second-largest continent, was casually divided like a piece of cake at the conference table. The mastermind behind this audacious event was Otto von Bismarck, the first chancellor of the newly unified German Empire, who was eager to secure portions of the continent already under exploration. This conference led to the creation of the General Act of the Berlin Conference, which has since been infamously dubbed the Scramble for Africa. The conference was a gathering of Europe's most powerful nations, all of whom were deeply invested in exploiting Africa's abundant resources. Their actions were conveniently justified under the pretense of civilizing or developing lands they deemed barbaric and primitive. This event marked a pivotal moment in history, where Africa's fate was decided by foreign powers with little regard for its people or their rich cultural legacy. The Berlin Conference marked a pivotal moment that set the stage for the systematic colonization of African nations by Western powers. This event led to the systematic stripping away of Africa's rich cultural heritage and linguistic diversity. By the time these countries finally achieved independence in the 20th century, the damage was already profound. The colonial powers had established structures and systems that were ill-equipped for fostering self-sufficiency, leaving the newly independent nations heavily dependent on their former colonizers. So, how did the Berlin Conference come into being, and what was its far-reaching impact on Africa? European nations operated under the misguided belief that Africa was an unclaimed territory, ripe for conquest and development. Notably absent from the Berlin Conference were any African leaders or representatives, despite the fact that Africa had already witnessed significant development long before European interference. By the 13th century, various African empires had achieved global prominence, capturing the interest and envy of the Western world. Stories of Africa's immense wealth seemed almost mythical until Henry Morton Stanley's discovery of the Congo River Basin in 1874 confirmed the continent's rich resources. One of the most eager participants in Africa's exploitation was King Leopold II of Belgium. Leopold had already established the International African Society, ostensibly aimed at civilizing Africa. He later collaborated with Stanley to form the International Congo Society, which, while similar in name, had more ambitious and self-serving objectives. Leopold was no mere businessman. He was a shrewd and cunning leader with a keen eye on enriching himself through Africa's resources. He dispatched explorers, who also served as his representatives, to claim vast tracts of land in Central Africa under the guise of a civilizing mission. Meanwhile, he covertly bought out investors in the International Congo Society to consolidate his control. As Leopold pursued his ambitions, other European nations quickly joined the scramble for Africa. France, alarmed by Leopold's hidden agenda, sent their own explorer, Pierre Savorgnan de Brazza, who established Brazzaville and hoisted the French flag. Portugal, too, staked its claim in the Congo region, bolstered by treaties with the ancient Kingdom of Congo. Soon, the race to claim Africa's rumored riches intensified, leading to fierce competition and conflict among European powers. Great Britain and France clashed over West Africa, Portugal and Egypt, with Britain over East Africa, and Leopold's Belgium found itself in direct conflict with France in Central Africa. The German Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, not to be outdone, also sought to assert Germany's imperial power by laying claim to African territories. The result was a chaotic and brutal scramble for control, forever altering the trajectory of the African continent. In a bold move to address the escalating conflicts over African territories, Bismarck took the initiative to convene the Berlin Conference. Recognizing that these disputes stemmed from an unequal distribution of Africa's vast economic potential, Bismarck called for the conference to rectify these imbalances. This clearly demonstrates that the primary objective of the Berlin Conference was economic gain rather than the development of African states. The gathering was a who's who of imperial powerhouses, including the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Belgium, Denmark, France, Great Britain, Italy, the Netherlands, Portugal, Russia, Spain, Sweden, Norway, and the Ottoman Empire. The conference commenced on November 15, 1884, and after 14 intense weeks, it concluded on February 26, 1885. The Berlin Conference was essentially a grand exercise in legalizing and formalizing territorial claims by European powers, who then mapped out Africa to prevent future conflicts. They also agreed upon trade regulations within their colonies and established a framework for future colonization. European explorers were dispatched to survey African lands, after which they would secure treaties with local leaders, ostensibly offering protection. These treaties were then taken back to Europe, where governments would negotiate among themselves to ensure their claims over African territories were recognized and unchallenged. In all these maneuvers, Africans were conspicuously excluded from the discussions, even though it was their land being divided. Europeans regarded them as incapable of self-governance. Often, indigenous rulers had little understanding of the treaties they were signing, and in some cases, the treaties were signed by leaders who lacked the legitimate authority to do so. However, one African leader stood out as an exception, Menelik of Ethiopia. With remarkable foresight, Menelik, who would later become emperor, wrote a letter to the conference participants, unequivocally stating that Ethiopia would not require their so-called protection. This defiant stance by Menelik highlighted Ethiopia's determination to remain independent, in stark contrast to the broader narrative of exploitation that characterized the Berlin Conference. Despite Menelik's assertive letter being dismissed, Ethiopia and Liberia remained the only African states to escape colonization during the ruthless scramble for Africa. The Sultan of Zanzibar, who desperately sought a seat at the Berlin Conference, was also ignored, unaware that his territory would be a central topic of discussion. The Berlin Conference culminated in the General Act, a document that laid the groundwork for new trade routes and set the stage for systematic colonization. This act addressed various aspects of African colonization, notably confirming the Congo Free State as the personal property of King Leopold II and ensuring the free navigation of the Niger and Congo rivers for international trade. Additionally, the General Act included the signing of an international agreement to prohibit the slave trade, which was seen as a moral victory at the time. One of the most significant outcomes of the General Act was the establishment of the principle of effectivity, which stipulated that a European power could only claim African territories if they actually controlled them. This principle meant that any country aspiring to claim a territory in Africa had to notify the other signatory powers to formalize and legitimize their possession. The Berlin Conference was a blatant disregard for African sovereignty, treating the views, opinions, and ownership rights of African people as utterly inconsequential. 14 countries were represented at the conference, and by its conclusion, 8 of them had staked claims to various regions of Africa. The remaining 6 participants, Austria-Hungary, Russia, Denmark, the Netherlands, Sweden, Norway, and the United States, did not take formal possession of any African territories. However, by the close of the 19th century, the European colonization of Africa was nearly complete, with the sole exceptions being Ethiopia and Liberia, which stood as proud symbols of resistance against the overwhelming tide of European imperialism. The conclusion of the Berlin Conference in 1885 marked a turning point that reshaped Africa's landscape through the forceful creation of new countries. This was done by arbitrarily merging diverse ethnic groups, cultures, languages, and peoples, completely disregarding the continent's existing boundaries, regions, and social structures. The conference not only legalized what had previously been illegal, but also laid the foundation for European collaboration in the systematic takeover of African states. The European powers claimed to offer protection to the territories they seized. But in reality, the 1884 to 1885 Berlin Conference became the birthplace of both colonization and the enduring conflicts among and within states and ethnic groups that persist to this day. The plunder extended far beyond land and territories. It also involved the theft of cultural artifacts, treasures, and resources, many of which Africa has yet to recover. The Europeans were clearly wolves in sheep's clothing, driven by a voracious appetite for Africa's natural resources to fuel the burgeoning industrial sectors of their own nations. To maintain their economic growth, they needed to secure African territories that would provide the raw materials they required and serve as markets for their manufactured goods. In the frenzied scramble for Africa, 50 countries were carved out, with each European power grabbing its share. Great Britain seized control of Egypt, Sudan, Uganda, Kenya, South Africa, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Botswana, Nigeria, and Ghana. France dominated much of West Africa, stretching from Mauritania to Chad, and also claimed Gabon and the Republic of Congo. Belgium, under King Leopold II, ruthlessly exploited the Democratic Republic of Congo, while Portugal took Mozambique in the east and Angola in the west. Italy established its grip on Somalia, known then as Italian Somaliland, and later acquired part of Ethiopia. Germany claimed Cameroon, Namibia, and Tanzania, while Spain, with the smallest share, secured Equatorial Guinea, the only Spanish-speaking country in Africa. This aggressive partitioning of Africa was driven by the Europeans' desire to fortify their industrial might, securing the vast resources and markets they deemed necessary for their economic ambitions. The consequences of these actions continue to resonate across the African continent today. The Berlin Conference, which dragged on for over 3 months, managed to sidestep some of the most pressing issues, leaving many critical questions unanswered. Remarkably, many of the representatives had never even set foot on African soil, yet they presumed they could comprehend and govern the complexities of African states from afar. Despite the glaring lack of recognition for African sovereignty, the Europeans insisted on signing treaties to legalize their exploitative relationships with African territories, a blatant contradiction of their own claims of legitimacy. While the general act of the conference purported to prohibit the slave trade, history bears witness to the horrific reality that over 10 million Africans in the Congo perished under King Leopold II's brutal regime, falling victim to starvation, disease, warfare, and unspeakable cruelty. The act was little more than a facade, designed to garner public approval and legitimacy for the European powers, while doing nothing to alleviate the suffering of the local populations under colonial rule. Instead, the indigenous people were subjected to relentless brutality, all to serve the selfish interests of their colonizers. Moreover, the notion of free trade, which was supposedly promoted by the conference, proved to be utterly unrealistic. The colonizing nations, having invested heavily in their imperial ambitions, were unwilling to allow genuine free trade within the territories they controlled, further entrenching their dominance and exploitation of Africa's resources. Take the Congo, for example, where under King Leopold's rule, it was run as a brutal monopoly, showcasing the true nature of European interests in Africa. The Berlin Conference, which claimed to curb the scramble for Africa, in reality, only fueled it further. While it was presented as a peaceful framework for European powers to claim African territories, it harbored a hidden agenda. Germany and Britain were less interested in peaceful colonization and more focused on using Africa to bolster their ambitions and secure their dominance as global powers. The consequences of the Berlin Conference were starkly different for Europe and Africa. For Europe, it was merely a failed enterprise, but for Africa, it inflicted lasting damage that continues to resonate today. The wounds of colonization run deep, with many African nations struggling to recover even after gaining independence. The legacy of artificial borders drawn during the conference has led to over 50 years of post-colonial conflict, resulting in more than 10 million deaths from civil wars, genocides, and border disputes. These aren't just statistics. They represent lives tragically lost, cultures obliterated, and a continent irrevocably transformed. Sadly, conflict still festers within Africa's borders. Some African diplomats have advocated for redrawing the map and redefining the boundaries imposed by colonial rulers, but this proposal is fraught with concerns. Many fear that such actions could exacerbate the already volatile political climate. The damage wrought by the Berlin Conference and subsequent colonization is so extensive that some believe it may never fully be repaired, leaving Africa to contend with the heavy burden of a troubled past. These fears have given rise to a counter-argument, that the colonial boundaries, however flawed, should be respected to maintain stability. Yet, simply preserving these borders does little to address the deep-seated damage that continues to fracture the continent. It has been 137 years since the Berlin Conference concluded, and the question remains: will Africa ever truly recover from the devastating impact of European invasion and exploitation? The scars left by colonization run deep, and the continent is still grappling with the consequences of a history marred by foreign plunder and interference. In conclusion, the Berlin Conference of 1884 was a turning point in African history. It was a moment when European greed and ambition were allowed to run rampant, with devastating consequences for the people of Africa. But it is also a reminder of the dangers of imperialism, the importance of sovereignty, and the need for global justice. As we look to the future, we must remember the lessons of the past. Africa is rising, but it does so with the weight of history on its shoulders. The Berlin Conference may have divided Africa, but it also revealed the strength and resilience of its people. And that is a story worth telling. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of the most pivotal moments in African history. If you found this video informative and engaging, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Let's continue to explore the stories that shape our world, stories that deserve to be told and heard. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep questioning the world around you.